Hey, welcome back. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about Exchange Server architecture. Now, entire books have been written on Exchange Server architecture. It's one of those topics that you can explore as deeply as you could ever possibly want to, and probably still not cover everything. Now, for the purposes of this video, my goal isn't to go super in depth into a discussion of Exchange Server architecture or to make anybody's heads hurt or anything like that. What I want to do is I want to talk about one very important architectural concept, and that is Exchange Server roles. Now, as you already know from the previous video, Exchange Server delivers a number of different services, things like mail, voicemail, calendars, and then there are also services like spam protection and virus protection and things like that. Well, all of these services are tied to various Exchange Server roles. Now, the interesting thing about Exchange Server roles, and the thing that you really need to know, is that the roles tend to evolve from one version of Exchange Server to the next, and Exchange 2016 is no exception. The roles that exist in Exchange 2016 are different from the roles that existed in Exchange 2013, and even those roles were different than what was found in some of the previous Exchange Server versions. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the roles, what they do, and how they've evolved across some of the more recent versions of Exchange Server. So I want to start out by talking about Exchange Server 2003. No, not Exchange Server 2013, Exchange Server 2003. From like 13 years ago. So why in the world am I talking about that? I mean, if ever there was obsolete software, that's probably it, right? Well, as counterintuitive and as unusual as it may sound, out of all of the recent Exchange Server versions, from a role standpoint, Exchange Server 2016 has more in common with Exchange Server 2003 than any other version. Now, in Exchange Server 2003, the roles were defined informally at best. But there were two roles. There was the front end server role and the back end server role. Again, these were informal, but they were roles. Now, the front end server's job was to shield the back end server from the internet. So that way you weren't exposing the back end server that did all of the heavy lifting directly to the internet, because let's face it, the internet is a pretty malicious place. So what would happen is new mail that was coming into the organization would enter through the front end server, and that server would proxy that mail to the back end server. So this is actually very similar to the way that roles work in Exchange Server 2016. You'll see this in a few slides. So things changed a lot with regard to Exchange Server roles in Exchange 2007. We went from having two loosely defined roles to five formally defined roles. And Exchange Server 2010 kept these same roles. So what were the roles? Well, there was the mailbox server role, and the mailbox server role held the mailbox database and the public folder database. There was also the client access server role, and this was the connection point for clients. The client access server also hosted Outlook Web Access or Outlook Web App, depending on what version of Exchange you were talking about. Then there was the Hub Transport server role. The Hub Transport server role maintained the message transport pipeline. We'll be talking a lot more about the pipeline in the lesson on compliance later on, but essentially this was a logical pipeline that messages passed through as they transited the Exchange Server organization. Then we had the Edge Transport server role. This was loosely the equivalent of the front-end server that we had in Exchange 2003. It sat at the edge of the network, and new messages coming into the organization passed through the Edge Transport server and then were relayed to back-end servers that hosted these other roles. Then we had the Unified Messaging role. The Unified Messaging role was what was responsible for hosting voicemail and Outlook Voice Access, which is a demand dial interface where people could contact Exchange through the phone and have Exchange verbally read email to them, schedule calendar appointments, and things like that. So in Exchange Server 2013, Microsoft decided to simplify things a bit. They condensed the roles down from 5 roles to 3 roles. So why was that? Well, the main reason why we had 5 roles in Exchange 2007 and 2010 had to do with computing power of the time. Physical servers had limited resources, and it made sense to split the various functionality into roles that could be placed on individual servers so that way those servers could collectively handle the workload that was being thrown at Exchange. But over time, computing power increased, and that wasn't as necessary anymore, and we went from having 5 roles to 3 roles. So in Exchange 2013, we ended up with the mailbox server, which is exactly the same as what we had before, except that now The transport pipeline and unified messaging are part of the mailbox server role. So the Exchange 2013 mailbox server is essentially the same as the 2010 mailbox server, unified messaging server, and hub transport server roles, all kind of condensed into one. We also have the client access server in Exchange 2013 and the Edge transport server, although it is worth noting that Microsoft was a little bit late to the game with the Edge transport server, and the Edge transport server role wasn't introduced until Exchange 2013 Service Pack 1. So in Exchange Server 2016, Microsoft decided to simplify things again. Now we've gone from having 3 roles down to having 2 roles. We have the mailbox server role and the Edge transport server role. The Edge transport role really hasn't changed much. The mailbox role does everything that the Edge transport role doesn't. It provides mailbox services and client access services. So remember a few minutes ago when I talked about Exchange Server 2003 with its front-end back-end roles? Well, Exchange Server 2016 is very similar to that. The Exchange 2003 front-end server role is roughly equivalent to the Edge transport role, and the back-end server role is similar to the mailbox role, because the mailbox role provides everything except for Edge transport services. So those are the roles that exist in Exchange Server 2016. So you're going to see these come up from time to time as we progress through all of the videos. So I just wanted to take a few minutes up front to talk about the roles that exist. So that's going to do it for this video, and we'll pick it up here in the next video by talking about the Exchange Server 2016 requirements.